The winter of 1944 to 1945 was one of the coldest Europe had seen in decades. Snow lay deep across the forests and fields of the Ardennes, turning roads into treacherous ribbons of ice and muffling the distant rumble of artillery. For months, the Allied armies had been pushing eastward after the Normandy breakout, driving the Germans back toward the Rhine. The front stretched thin, especially in the quiet sector of the Ardennes, where inexperienced divisions held the line while veterans recovered or prepared for new offensives. On the morning of December 16, 1944, that quiet shattered. Under cover of thick fog and blinding snowstorms, Adolf Hitler launched his last great gamble in the West, Operation Watch on the Rhine. Nearly 500,000 German troops, supported by over 1,000 tanks and assault guns, smashed through the American lines in a narrow, 60-mile front. The objective was ambitious: split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The Americans, caught completely by surprise, fell back in confusion. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles, soldiers trudged through drifts, and entire units were encircled. At the heart of the German advance lay Bastogne, a small Belgian market town whose 7 radiating roads made it a vital crossroads. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the flow of men and supplies through the region. By December 19th, the town was already surrounded. Its defenders, the 101st Airborne Division under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, holding out against overwhelming odds. That same morning, in a damp, unheated stone barracks in Verdun, France, the Allied High Command convened in emergency session. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, stood at the head of the map table, his face drawn but resolute. Around him gathered the senior American commanders, Lieutenant General Omar N. Bradley of the 12th Army Group, Lieutenant General Courtney H. Hodges of the 1st Army, Lieutenant General William H. Simpson of the 9th Army, and Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., whose 3rd Army had been fighting fiercely along the Saar River to the south. The room was thick with tension. Intelligence officers briefed the latest reports: German panzer divisions driving deep, American units shattered or isolated, the salient growing wider by the hour. Eisenhower refused to see it as disaster. He insisted it was an opportunity to catch large German forces in the open and destroy them. The strategy took shape quickly: counterattack from the north with Montgomery's 21st Army Group and from the south with Bradley's forces, pinching off the bulge at its base. The northern attack would take time to organize. All eyes turned to the south. Patton's 3rd Army was oriented east, its supply lines stretched toward the Saar offensive. To strike north, it would have to execute a complete 90-degree wheel, repositioning 3 corps, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks and trucks, across frozen, narrow roads in blizzard conditions. Conventional staff estimates gave it 10 days at best. Patton studied the map in silence for a long moment. He had come prepared. Before leaving Nancy the previous day, he had ordered his staff to develop 3 contingency plans for exactly such a crisis. Now he spoke with characteristic certainty. 3 divisions could attack northward within 48 hours. The spearhead would be the 4th Armored Division, supported by the 80th and 26th Infantry Divisions. The attack would begin on December 22nd. The room fell quiet. Bradley cautioned restraint. Other generals exchanged skeptical glances. No one believed it possible. Yet Patton's reputation for aggressive maneuver and relentless drive carried weight. Eisenhower approved the plan, assigning the southern counterattack to the 3rd Army. As the meeting broke up, private doubts remained. The weather was brutal: sub-zero temperatures, drifting snow, roads glazed with ice. Fuel and ammunition shortages threatened to halt any advance before it began. Men would suffer in open trucks, engines would seize in the cold. That evening, back at 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy, amid the chaos of shifting orders and ringing telephones, Patton found a moment of quiet. On his desk lay a thick envelope marked Priority Air Mail, forwarded from the States. The handwriting was unmistakable: Beatrice Ayer Patton, his wife of 34 years, waiting at their home in Massachusetts. Beatrice was far more than the supportive spouse history often reduced her to. Born into Boston's elite Ayer family, she had grown up surrounded by wealth, culture, and intellectual freedom. From their first meeting as young adults, she matched Patton's passion for military history. They studied campaigns together, Hannibal, Napoleon, Grant, debating tactics over long evenings. Their marriage was a true partnership of minds. Throughout the war, Beatrice transformed their home into a private war room, spreading maps across tables, tracking every advance and setback through censored letters and newspaper clippings. This letter had arrived at the perfect moment. Written days before the German offensive broke into public news, Beatrice had sensed trouble from fragmented reports. Drawing on their shared historical knowledge, she offered more than comfort, she offered strategy. Enclosed were several maps annotated in her careful hand. She highlighted forgotten secondary roads that froze solid in winter, rivers whose ice could bear the weight of tanks where bridges were destroyed, shortcuts through the Eifel Hills that avoided main highways under German observation. Her core idea was revolutionary in its simplicity: abandon rigid supply doctrine. Treat logistics as fluid, requisition fuel and rations from rear units en route, seize enemy dumps early, prioritize speed above all protocol. Arrive first, with audacity. Patton read late into the night, the ideas crystallizing possibilities he had only vaguely sensed. Beatrice's vision gave him the daring framework needed to make the impossible timetable real. By dawn on December 20th, new orders cascaded across the Third Army. Columns began moving north under blackout conditions, engines roaring in the darkness, men shivering in the open cold. The greatest wheel in military history had begun, inspired not solely by one general's fire, but by the unseen strategic mind of the woman who knew him best. The race to relieve Bastogne and rewrite the course of the war was underway. The Third Army's headquarters in Nancy hummed with barely contained urgency throughout the night of December 20th into the early hours of the 21st. Telephones rang constantly, staff officers hunched over maps under the harsh glow of desk lamps, runners carried fresh intelligence reports from radio rooms still crackling with intercepted German transmissions. Outside, snow continued to fall in heavy, silent sheets, blanketing the courtyards and muffling the growl of engines as advance parties prepared to move north. In the midst of this controlled storm, George Patton retreated to the small private office that served as his sanctuary. The door closed behind him with a soft click, shutting out the clamor for a precious few minutes. He removed his helmet, ran a hand through thinning hair, and sat heavily at the desk. The weight of command pressed on him, not just the lives of hundreds of thousands of men, but the knowledge that history itself hung in the balance. On the desk lay Beatrice's letter, now creased from multiple readings. Beside it were the maps she had annotated, spread out like a secret battle plan. Patton lit a cigar, the smoke curling toward the low ceiling, and allowed himself to sink fully into her words once more. Beatrice Ayer Patton had never been content to remain on the periphery of her husband's world. Born in 1886 into one of America's wealthiest families, she grew up in a milieu of privilege and expectation. Yet from an early age she displayed an independence of mind that set her apart. Educated privately, fluent in French and German, an accomplished horsewoman and pianist, she could have chosen a life of leisure. Instead, she chose George Patton, a brash, ambitious young cavalry officer with little money but boundless drive. Their courtship was passionate and intellectual. They rode together across California hills, debated poetry and philosophy, and discovered a shared obsession with military history that would define their marriage. Beatrice read the same dense tomes George devoured: Clausewitz, Jomini, the campaigns of Frederick the Great and Napoleon. She challenged his interpretations, offered alternative readings of battles, and proved time and again that her grasp of strategy matched his own. When war came in 1941, Beatrice transformed their home at Green Meadows in South Hamilton, Massachusetts, into a personal command post. Large maps covered the walls of George's study. She tracked every reported advance through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and the carefully censored letters he sent. She annotated margins with questions, suggestions, historical parallels. Each letter she wrote back was part diary, part strategic briefing, encouragement wrapped in sharp analysis. The current letter, dated just days before the German offensive began, was extraordinary even by their standards. Beatrice had sensed something brewing from the sudden drop in news from the Ardennes sector and the vague hints in George's recent correspondence. Drawing on memories of their long discussions about winter campaigns, she anticipated the crisis with uncanny accuracy. Her central idea challenged the very foundations of Allied logistical thinking. American doctrine emphasized methodical, secure supply lines, depots built sequentially, fuel and ammunition delivered in measured stages. It was safe, predictable, and slow. In a war of movement, Beatrice argued, it could be fatal. Instead, she proposed treating logistics as opportunistic and fluid. Frozen secondary roads, little more than farm tracks in summer, became viable arteries when hardened by frost. Rivers and streams, their surfaces thick with ice, could serve as natural bridges for tanks where the enemy had destroyed conventional crossings. Main highways, easily observed and defended, should be avoided altogether. Spearheads should push forward aggressively, sustaining themselves by requisitioning supplies from any Allied unit along the route. Hospital convoys, artillery parks, even British depots if necessary. Enemy fuel dumps, once overrun, would replenish the advance. Risk was inherent. Units might operate on half rations for days. Tanks could run dry miles from the objective. But the reward was decisive, arriving 2 or 3 days ahead of German expectations, disrupting their timetable before reserves could solidify. Her maps were masterpieces of practical insight. Using scale rulers and colored pencils, she traced routes through the rugged Eifel region that shaved hours, and sometimes entire days, off projected travel times. She noted ice thickness estimates based on temperature reports, potential fords, forest trails wide enough for Shermans but too narrow for heavier German Tigers. Small, precise notes marked danger points and alternatives. Patton exhaled slowly, watching smoke drift. Beatrice's plan aligned perfectly with his own philosophy of war: speed, aggression, audacity. Yet it went further, providing the logistical backbone his staff had struggled to define. Where orthodox planners saw impassable terrain, Beatrice saw opportunity. He summoned his chief of staff, Brigadier General Hobart, Hap Gay, and the G4 logistics officer into the office shortly after midnight. Without revealing the source, he rarely shared the full extent of Beatrice's contributions. He spread her maps atop the official overlays and issued sweeping new directives. Secondary roads were elevated to primary status. Fuel trucks were detached from rear depots and attached directly to combat commands. Quartermasters received blanket authority to requisition supplies from any unit in the path of advance, backed by Patton's signature. Artillery and anti-aircraft units were ordered to displace forward in leaps, keeping pace with the armor. By 0300 hours on December 21st, the revised plan was complete. Radio messages went out under highest priority. Divisions began executing the wheel immediately, columns forming in darkness, headlights dimmed, engines idling to avoid detection. Patton returned to the letter one final time before dawn. At the bottom, in Beatrice's familiar script, she had added a personal postscript that cut straight to his heart. Remember always, Georgie, that war is won by those who arrive first with the most audacity. You have that audacity in abundance. Trust it. Trust yourself. And know that every night I study the maps and pray for your victory. Ever your devoted B. He folded the pages carefully and slipped them inside his tunic, close to his heart, a talisman stronger than any lucky charm he carried. Then he stepped back into the operations room, voice calm and commanding. The Third Army was moving. The impossible pivot had begun. And though history would record the coming triumph as Patton's alone, he knew the deeper truth. The spark that made it possible had crossed an ocean in a woman's handwriting. Outside, the snow kept falling, but the roads north were already filling with the rumble of tanks and trucks, heading toward Bastogne at a speed no one thought achievable. Dawn on December 22, 1944, broke over eastern Luxembourg in a pale, reluctant light. The sky hung low and heavy, thick with cloud, as columns of the Third Army began their northward surge. Engines coughed to life in frozen assembly areas near Arlon and Longwy, exhaust plumes rising like ghosts into the frigid air. Sherman tanks of the 4th Armored Division, their whitewash camouflage streaked with mud, rumbled onto narrow roads already glazed with ice. Behind them came endless lines of trucks carrying the 80th and 26th Infantry Divisions, men bundled in overcoats, helmets frosted, rifles clutched against the biting wind. No military maneuver quite like this had been attempted before. An entire army, 3 corps, more than 250,000 men, 133,000 vehicles, countless tons of fuel, ammunition, and rations, wheeling 90 degrees in the dead of European winter. The distance from the Third Army's previous positions along the Sarre to Bastogne was over 100 miles through some of the most difficult terrain on the Western Front. The rugged Eifel Hills, dense forests, narrow valleys choked with snowdrifts, rivers frozen on the surface but treacherous beneath. Conventional wisdom declared it impossible in less than 10 days. Patton had promised 48 hours of combat advance. Beatrice's ideas, now fully integrated into the plan, made the difference between ambition and feasibility. The advance began under cover of darkness the previous night. Lead elements followed the unconventional routes she had marked, frozen secondary roads that wound through villages and farmland, avoiding the few paved highways the Germans watched and mined. Where bridges had been blown, tanks tested the ice of rivers and streams, crews tense as hulls creaked across surfaces that held just long enough. Combat engineers worked ceaselessly, bulldozing drifts, spreading gravel and steel matting, felling trees to widen passages. Logistics, the silent killer of armies, became the true test. Beatrice's concept of fluid supply was executed with ruthless efficiency. As spearheads outran their planned depots, quartermasters descended on rear area units with signed orders from Patton himself. Fuel trucks were siphoned on the spot. Ration convoys bound for static hospitals or artillery parks found themselves emptied into combat columns rolling north. Even British supply points along the route contributed under protest. Patton's authority overrode international niceties. The advance fed on opportunism, sustaining momentum at the cost of perfect order. By midday on the 22nd, the 4th Armored Division had already covered nearly 50 kilometers. Astonishing progress through blinding squalls and sporadic German resistance. Outposts of the German 5th Panzer Army contested crossroads and villages, but the velocity of the American thrust disrupted their defense. Tanks bypassed strong points when possible, leaving them for following infantry. Artillery batteries displaced forward in daring leaps, unlimbering to fire in support before packing up again. Patton himself moved constantly along the axis of advance. He rode in an open jeep despite the cold, scarf wrapped around his neck, binoculars hanging ready. He stopped frequently, encouraging exhausted crews, cursing stalled vehicles back into motion, studying maps with unit commanders under red-filtered flashlights. In quieter moments, between radio calls and hurried conferences, he touched the pocket where Beatrice's letter rested. Her words echoed, "Arrive first with the most audacity." The human cost was immediate and brutal. Men suffered frostbite in open trucks. Engines overheated or seized in the extreme cold. Vehicles slid into ditches, requiring hours to recover. Casualties from German ambushes and artillery mounted steadily. Yet morale held, fueled by Patton's visible presence and the knowledge that Bastonne's defenders were counting on them. Nightfall on December 23rd found the spearheads pressing deeper into Belgium. Combat Command A of the 4th Armored fought through Chaumont and Rimonville, while Combat Command B pushed along parallel routes. Snow turned to sleet, then back to heavy flakes, reducing visibility to yards. Crews navigated by compass and instinct, guided by engineers who walked ahead probing for mines. Christmas Eve brought a brief respite in the weather, clouds thinning, stars visible for the first time in days. Then, on Christmas morning, the sky cleared completely. Allied air forces, grounded for a week, roared into action. Hundreds of fighters and medium bombers struck German columns, supply dumps, and reinforcements struggling westward. The Luftwaffe, outnumbered and fuel-starved, could offer only token resistance. The final push came on December 26th. Combat Command R, under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, drove toward Assenois, 5 miles south of Bastogne. German defenses stiffened, Panzer IVs and anti-tank guns concealed in woods and villages. Abrams tanks fought through Neuf and Cloquemont, losing several Shermans to hidden 88mm guns. Ammunition ran low. Crews fired their last rounds at point-blank range. In the late afternoon, under heavy fire, Abrams ordered a daring charge. A task force of tanks and half-tracks dashed straight down the Assenois-Bastogne road, shooting up German positions as they went. At 1650, the lead tanks burst into Bastogne southern outskirts. Paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, gaunt from the siege, emerged from foxholes cheering hoarsely. Supplies were rushed forward: ammunition, medical stores, hot food. The corridor was open. In just over 4 days since the attack began, covering more than 160 kilometers from starting positions, the Third Army had shattered the southern flank of the German salient. The relief of Bastogne marked the turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. In the shattered streets amid embracing soldiers, Patton allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The official dispatches would credit his leadership, his aggressive doctrine, his refusal to accept delay. And rightly so. He had driven the execution with unrelenting will. Yet he knew the deeper truth, the logistical daring that made the timetable possible, the routes that carried the armor through impossible terrain, the concept of fluid supply that sustained the thrust, all traced back to annotated maps and careful handwriting from a study in Massachusetts. That night, in a commandeered building on Bastogne's outskirts, Patton drafted a message to be sent at first secure opportunity. Dearest B, your roads carried us through exactly as you foresaw. The ice held, the shortcuts worked, the audacity paid off. Bastogne is relieved tonight because of what you saw on those maps. My warrior queen, history will record this as my victory, but we both know the part you played. Ever your devoted Georgie. The greatest counterattack of the Western Front had succeeded. The Bulge would soon collapse entirely. But the story behind the triumph remained hidden, a partnership of minds across an ocean, where one strategist wore stars on his shoulders, and the other waited quietly at home, shaping destiny with ink and insight. January 1945 brought a gradual thaw to the Ardennes, both literal and figurative. Snow began to melt under weak winter sun, turning battlefields into quagmires of mud and revealing the full extent of the destruction. Wrecked tanks littered roadsides, abandoned German equipment lay scattered across fields, and makeshift graves marked the frozen ground where men had fallen. The German salient, once a threatening bulge deep into Allied territory, had collapsed entirely. Hitler's last offensive in the West ended in catastrophic failure, costing the Wehrmacht irreplaceable men, tanks, and aircraft it could never replace. In the aftermath, accolades poured in for George S. Patton and the Third Army. American newspapers hailed the relief of Bastogne as a Christmas miracle of arms. War correspondents wrote vivid accounts of Patton racing along icy roads in his open jeep, urging exhausted troops onward with characteristic fire. British papers, often critical of the brash American general, grudgingly acknowledged the brilliance of the counterattack. Even Montgomery, whose own northern thrust had been slower and more methodical, sent formal congratulations. Patton accepted the praise with outward satisfaction, knowing it would strengthen his position for the final push into Germany. Yet in private moments, late nights in commandeered chateaus, quiet hours drafting reports, he carried a deeper awareness. The triumph belonged not solely to him, but to a partnership forged over decades, one whose most vital contributions remained invisible to the world. Beatrice Ayer Patton, back at Green Meadows in Massachusetts, followed every development through delayed newspapers and official communiques. She clipped articles, added them to scrapbooks already thick with the war's progress, and continued her nightly ritual of studying maps under a green banker's lamp. The relief of Bastogne reached American headlines days after the fact, and when it did, she allowed herself a rare moment of quiet exultation. She knew, from George's brief but coded messages, that her ideas had played their part. Their correspondence intensified in the weeks following the battle. Patton's letters, written in snatched moments between advances, were more reflective than usual. He described the roads her maps had opened, the ice crossings that held under tank weight, the seized fuel dumps that kept engines running. He credited her openly in private words he knew would never see public light. "Without your vision, B," he wrote in one, "we would have arrived too late. The staff thought me mad for the timetable, but your routes proved them wrong. You saw what none of them could from 3,000 miles away. My warrior queen, you command from the shadows better than most generals in the light." Beatrice responded with characteristic modesty, downplaying her role while offering fresh analysis for the coming Rhine crossings. She reminded him of historical precedents, Caesar's rapid marches, Grant's relentless pressure, and urged caution against overconfidence as the Reich crumbled. To the outside world, Beatrice remained the dutiful general's wife, elegant, supportive, occasionally visible at social functions or bond drives. Few knew of the study filled with military texts, the walls covered in campaign maps, the correspondence that functioned as an unofficial strategic dialogue. Even their children, Beatrice Jr., Ruth Ellen, and young George, understood only partially the depth of their parents' intellectual bond. Patton himself guarded the secret carefully. In a warrior's culture that prized visible command, admitting significant influence from a woman at home risked ridicule. Yet he never forgot. In quiet conversations with trusted aides like Hap Gay or Colonel Charles Codman, he occasionally let slip references to ideas from home or the best staff officer I've got across the ocean. Those who knew the Pattons well understood. As the Third Army raced across Germany in the spring of 1945, capturing cities, liberating concentration camps, linking up with the Red Army at the Elbe, the partnership continued. Beatrice's letters arrived regularly, carried by priority airmail, offering insights drawn from fresh reading. She warned of potential German holdouts in the Alps, suggested approaches to the Danube crossings, even commented on political implications as Roosevelt's death shook the Allied world. Patton treasured each one. He carried a growing packet inside his tunic, alongside his pistols and Lucky Charms. In moments of exhaustion or doubt, he reread passages that renewed his resolve. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Patton, now a four-star general, stood among the victors at Reims and later Berlin. Celebrations erupted across the continent and at home. Yet victory brought new challenges: occupation duties, demobilization politics, tensions with the Soviets. Patton chafed under restraint, longing for new fields of action. Through it all, Beatrice remained his anchor. Plans formed for his return, reunion at Green Meadows, perhaps a quiet period before whatever came next. She prepared the house, corresponded with old friends, dreamed of the life they would rebuild. But the story of the Bulge, and Beatrice's hidden role in its turning point, stayed buried. Official histories recorded Patton's genius, the Third Army's heroism, the weather's timely clearing. The annotated maps, the letters that shaped logistics, the woman whose strategic clarity helped make the impossible advance possible. These remained private treasures. In the broader sweep of history, Beatrice Ayer Patton would be remembered primarily as the devoted wife who endured separations and supported her famous husband. The depth of her contribution, the mind that matched his, the ideas that helped win battles, faded into the background, known fully only to the two of them. Yet in the quiet truth they shared, the legend of Patton's greatest counterattack carried an unspoken epilogue. Behind every visible commander stands, sometimes, an unseen one whose influence shapes destiny from the shadows. And as Patton prepared for homecoming in the summer of 1945, that partnership, forged in youth, tested by war, deepened by distance, stood stronger than ever, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead in peacetime. Summer 1945 bathed the northeastern United States in warm, golden light. After the surrender of Germany in May and the final capitulation of Japan in August, the nation erupted in celebration. Parades filled city streets, churches rang bells, families reunited on train platforms across the country. For the Patton family, the long separation was finally ending. George S. Patton returned to American soil in June 1945, greeted with honors befitting a conquering hero. In Boston, crowds lined the streets as he rode in an open car, waving to cheering thousands. Newspapers ran front-page photographs. The four-star general, tanned from European campaigns, smiling broadly beside Beatrice, elegant in a tailored suit and hat. Their reunion at Green Meadows was private and emotional. Embraces long held in imagination now made real, quiet evenings walking the grounds they both loved, talking late into the night as if no time had passed. The house came alive again. Children and grandchildren visited, staff bustled with preparations for a new chapter. Patton, temporarily assigned to the 15th Army in Germany for historical and occupation duties, received extended leave. Plans formed, perhaps a memoir, lectures at West Point and the Army War College, even quiet retirement to raise horses in Virginia or California. Beatrice looked forward to reclaiming the intellectual partnership that distance had only strengthened. Yet beneath the joy ran undercurrents of unease. Patton chafed at peacetime constraints. He clashed with superiors over denazification policy, spoke bluntly about the growing Soviet threat, and expressed frustration at the rapid demobilization that was dismantling the armies he had led to victory. In letters to friends and in private conversations with Beatrice, he revealed a restlessness that peace could not satisfy. Beatrice, ever the steady counterbalance, counseled patience. She had spent the war years managing the household alone, raising funds for war bonds, corresponding not only with George but with dozens of officers' wives. Now she urged him toward writing, capturing his experiences and philosophy for posterity. Together they began organizing his papers, war diaries, battle maps, the thick bundles of their wartime letters. In quiet evenings by the fireplace, they revisited campaigns, debating interpretations as they always had. One project took particular shape: Patton's intended memoirs, later published as War as I Knew It. Beatrice became his unofficial editor and sounding board. She reviewed chapters, suggested clarifications, reminded him of details he had overlooked. The section on the Battle of the Bulge received special attention. Patton described the Verdun meeting, the bold commitment of 48 hours, the daring wheel northward. He wrote vividly of the weather, the roads, the relief of Bastogne. Between them, an unspoken understanding guided what was included and what was omitted. The annotated maps, the letter that crystallized the logistical concept, the woman whose strategic insight had shaped the advance, these remained absent from the public record. Patton hinted at contingency planning and alternative routes, but credited staff work and his own intuition. Beatrice never pressed for recognition. She understood the era's expectations and the military culture that prized visible command. Still, in private, Patton acknowledged her fully. In marginal notes on drafts, in conversations late at night, he referred to the Bulge relief as our victory. He spoke of wanting future generations to know the truth someday, perhaps in a later volume or private papers. Beatrice smiled and changed the subject. She valued the partnership itself more than public credit. As autumn 1945 approached, Patton returned briefly to Germany for occupation duties. Beatrice accompanied him on part of the trip, their first time together in Europe since before the war. They visited battlefields he had fought over, drove roads the Third Army had taken, stood in silence at cemeteries where his soldiers lay. The experience deepened their bond, a shared remembrance of sacrifice and triumph. Back in America by fall, Patton accepted command of the Third Army again, now stationed stateside for training and demobilization. Life settled into a rhythm: inspections, speeches, family gatherings. He and Beatrice spent weekends riding, discussing history, planning a future that finally seemed within reach. Yet fate, as so often in Patton's life, had other plans. On December 9, 1945, while on a pheasant hunting trip near Mannheim, Germany, he had returned for a short visit. Patton's staff car was involved in a collision with an army truck. He suffered a broken neck and paralysis. Rushed to a hospital in Heidelberg, he lingered for 12 days, conscious and remarkably calm. Beatrice flew immediately to his side, arriving on December 12th. She remained with him constantly, reading to him, talking quietly of their life together, holding his hand as doctors offered little hope. In those final days, they spoke of many things: their children, shared memories, the campaigns they had analyzed together. Patton expressed no fear of death, only regret at leaving unfinished work. On the evening of December 21, 1945, George S. Patton died with Beatrice at his bedside. The nation mourned. Headlines announced the loss of America's greatest fighting general. Funeral services in Heidelberg and later burial at Hamm, Luxembourg, among his soldiers drew thousands. Beatrice bore the grief with characteristic composure, arranging details, comforting family, preserving dignity. In the months that followed, she returned to Green Meadows and began the long task of shaping his legacy. Papers were organized, memoirs finalized for publication, correspondence sorted. The wartime letters, hundreds of pages of strategic dialogue, personal devotion, shared intellectual fire, were carefully preserved. But the full story of Beatrice's contribution to the Bulge counterattack, and to so many other decisions, remained locked away. She chose silence, believing the focus should stay on George and the men who fought. History, she knew, would record what it needed. Yet in quiet moments, studying the old maps one last time, Beatrice allowed herself private satisfaction. The advance that turned the tide in December 1944, the impossible 160-kilometer thrust in 48 hours, carried her fingerprints as clearly as his. Their partnership had shaped destiny, even if only they fully knew it. The war hero's legend grew brighter with time. But the woman who had been his equal in mind and spirit carried the deeper truth forward alone, into a future now forever changed. The years following George Patton's death unfolded quietly at Green Meadows, yet with a profound sense of purpose for Beatrice Ayer Patton. The world moved on from the war. America entered an era of prosperity and Cold War tension. Veterans returned to civilian life, and the names of great battles began to fade into textbooks. Beatrice, now in her 60s, became the guardian of her husband's memory, determined that his legacy would endure not as myth alone, but as a source of inspiration and instruction for future generations. She threw herself into the work of preservation. Patton's papers, diaries, letters, battle reports, annotated books, filled rooms at the family home. With the help of trusted aides and historians, Beatrice organized, catalogued, and edited the memoir War as I Knew It was published in 1947 to widespread acclaim, offering readers Patton's own voice on leadership, tactics, and the human cost of command. Beatrice ensured the text remained true to his style, direct, colorful, unapologetic, while gently smoothing passages that might have proven too controversial in the post-war climate. She also oversaw the donation of materials to institutions: West Point, the Army War College, the Library of Congress. Maps from every campaign were carefully rolled and labeled, correspondence bound in volumes. Among these treasures lay the wartime letters between husband and wife, hundreds of pages that revealed the depth of their partnership. Beatrice considered publishing selections but ultimately decided against it. Some truths, she believed, were too intimate, too nuanced for public consumption in an age that still viewed military genius as solitary and masculine. Instead, she chose subtler ways to honor the unseen contributions. In private conversations with biographers and historians who visited Green Meadows, she offered insights that shaped their understanding. She spoke of George's relentless study, his respect for history, and, when pressed, the collaborative nature of their thinking. A few perceptive writers caught hints of her role, mentions and footnotes of Mrs. Patton's keen interest in strategy, or the general's habit of consulting family correspondence. But the full story of the Bulge advance, of the annotated maps that guided the Third Army through frozen roads, remained unclaimed. Beatrice lived actively into her later years. She traveled, lectured occasionally on military history, supported veterans' causes, and maintained the family estates. She rode horses until well into her 70s, her posture straight and confident in the saddle, just as it had been in youth. Friends and family marveled at her resilience, the same intellectual clarity and quiet strength that had sustained her through decades of separation and loss. In the 1950s and 1960s, as new generations studied World War II, interest in Patton surged again. Hollywood immortalized him in the 1970 film Patton, with George C. Scott's towering performance capturing the public imagination. Beatrice served as a consultant, ensuring accuracy in details great and small. She approved the portrayal of Patton as brilliant, flawed, and fearless, but privately noted what the screen could not show: the late-night discussions, the letters that crossed oceans carrying ideas as vital as ammunition. The film's success brought renewed attention to the family. Visitors, scholars, and journalists sought Beatrice out. Some asked directly about her own role in George's career. She answered with grace and deflection, "We shared a love of history. That was our bond." Only in rare moments, with those she trusted deeply, did she allow a fuller truth to emerge: that the partnership had been one of equals, that strategy born in a quiet study in Massachusetts had sometimes reached the battlefield as decisively as orders from headquarters. As the decades passed, military historians began to reassess the contributions of women behind the front lines: codebreakers, planners, intelligence analysts, and the wives who sustained morale and offered counsel. Beatrice's story fit this broader pattern, yet remained distinctive. No other general's spouse had engaged so deeply in tactical and logistical thinking, No other correspondence quite matched the Pattons for intellectual depth. In her final years, living quietly with family, Beatrice reflected often on the winter of 1944. She kept one particular map on her desk, the one she had annotated before the bulge, its routes now faded but still visible. On quiet evenings she traced the paths with her finger, remembering the urgency of those days, the knowledge that lives hung on speed and audacity. Beatrice Ayer Patton passed away on September 30th, 1973, at the age of 87. She was buried beside her husband in a simple ceremony, her contributions still largely unspoken. Yet seeds had been planted. In archives and private collections, the letters waited. Scholars poring over the Patton papers in later decades began to piece together the fuller picture. The references in George's diaries to BEA's ideas, the surviving annotated maps, the consistent pattern of insights arriving from home at critical moments. Today, in the 21st century, historians increasingly recognize Beatrice not merely as a supportive wife, but as a genuine intellectual partner whose strategic contributions helped shape key moments of the war, including the daring advance that turned the Battle of the Bulge. The 160-kilometer thrust in 48 hours remains celebrated as Patton's triumph, a masterpiece of aggressive maneuver. But the deeper story, one of collaboration across distance, of a woman whose mind matched a warrior's, of an idea born in quiet study that reached a frozen battlefield and changed history, has finally begun to emerge. It is the unwritten chapter that completes the legend. Behind the visible commander stood an unseen one, whose clarity and courage helped make the impossible real. And in that partnership, perhaps, lies the most enduring lesson of all, that true greatness in war, as in life, is rarely solitary.